now, please. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to give you 10 seconds, and then I'm going to talk anyway. Right, so now we're moving on to discussion 2. What are the challenges and options for harmonising cybersecurity capacity building with human rights? It flows very nicely from the discussion on culture earlier this morning. It's going to be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Ian Brown, and we also have contributions from Gilberto Martins della Media, and I apologise, I have not said that correctly, I'm sure, from Brazil, Professor Daukorf from London Metropolitan University, and I'm seeing a third member, Ian.
Surprise.
Okay, so I'll hand straight over to Ian then. Thank you.
Thanks, Sadie. And I should mention our surprise guest, thanks for joining us at very late notice, is Dr. Andrea Matwishin, who is a senior policy advisor to the US Federal Trade Commission and also an academic researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm just going to very briefly introduce the subject and then hand over to our excellent panel, and we're going to follow Ivan's example and stick strictly to time so that we have plenty of time for discussion with you all. I think one of the positive things that has come out of the Snowden revelations over the summer is that two communities which were slightly disjoint in the past, those on perhaps more on the military and national security side who had been mainly focused on international humanitarian law and issues about the use of force on the one side, thinking about cybersecurity, and on the other, people focused on international human rights law. And I think now this hopefully will be one of many events where those two communities start to talk together and work out how these different areas of international law fit. They do. I've heard in the past, as has Dower, I know, events where people have said that they can't possibly fit together. They do very well, which I'm sure Dower will explain in his presentation. I'm sure you're all aware that the Human Rights Council has affirmed several times now that the human rights that apply offline do apply equally online. Of course, we have had since the Second World War the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, amplifying that, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which of course talks about the right to privacy, but also the closely related rights online of freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly. You might have seen reported just a couple of weeks back, the Council of Europe had their big 4-year ministerial conference in Belgrade, where they looked at freedom of expression and democracy in the digital age. They've published a political declaration coming out of that, which you can find online. And I think one of the, as well as the cultural aspects that we'll pick up on from this morning's discussion, I thought another important point that one of the people in the audience made earlier today was how can we give confidence to states, to businesses and to internet users that the data sharing that is required for the purposes of information security is done in a way that protects their interests. And of course, international human rights law is an important part of that. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Andrea, and I hope Andrea in particular is going to tell us about some of the debates there have been in the United States in the last couple of years on cybersecurity legislation in Congress and some of the privacy issues that have held that up to some extent.
Thank you, Ian. It's my great privilege to be with you here today at this very exciting event, not only for Oxford, but in general for the study of information security as a whole. The next comment, as the good lawyer that I am, I must disclaim that any of my commentary is my commentary alone, does not reflect the official views of the Federal Trade Commission, nor any potential enforcement priorities that may exist in the future. So, with that said, Ian has asked me to share some reflections, in particular about the direction of Congress in the United States and the way that the debate within the United States is evolving around issues of information security. Playing up on the very important comment that was made by Professor Sadie Creese closing the last session, what we're seeing in the United States in particular is an increasingly uncomfortable tension among the ideas of the preservation of the economic and individual human rights of citizens as being balanced against concerns of innovation policy and, third, national security and ideas of physical defense. So this three-way tension is generating confusion in the discourse in Congress and in the broader paradigms that we apply to information security questions as a whole. So with that, a few reflections on some of the developments in Congress. In general, Congress is demonstrating a struggle with trying to conceptualize information security questions. I testified in front of Congress in July, and what struck me was this idea of whether the appropriate paradigms and historical reference points are things more in line with kidnapping and physical attacks that we need to preserve integrity of citizens against, or whether there is a different model of some sort of rights-based or other approach that is not mapping tightly to physical space questions that we've encountered before. That is coupled with sometimes an overconfidence in the ability of these traditional paradigms, particularly of warfare, to map to the questions that non-state actors in particular present as a challenge to the preservation of the rights of citizens and the structures of government that nation states have traditionally had domain over. A small number of attackers can disrupt a tremendous network of interconnected elements. And to that end, this question of what it will take to get coordinated private and public sector conduct around these broader questions of information security is something that remains unclear, but the consensus that seems to be emerging is that it's going to take some sort of dramatic incident in the United States. I've been calling this a flaming river of information security, which is a historical reference to the way that environmental law was passed in the United States. And environmental law, much like some of the questions that we face today, has obviously implications for the dignity and the human rights and the health and welfare of citizens in some of the similar ways, perhaps, that information security questions raise, particularly where the harms are not transparent necessarily. In Congress in particular, what is shaking out to be a group of perhaps complex dynamics, there's a battle between the ideas of transparency and information sharing as an inherent good, both in terms of preserving the rights of citizens and the national defense, and to get public and private sector cooperation centralized within government structures. But simultaneously, the private sector is pushing back, particularly post-Snowden revelations, and particularly when we look at what is perceived to be by many in the private sector as basic deficits of information control that exist within government structures. Talking with the dodgy libertarians of Silicon Valley, as we've heard them referenced, there's a question that's a fair technical one. Yes, we all want to secure the structures that our society depends upon. However, putting all of these information eggs in one basket with a bottom of weak wicker where things fall through, which is the perception at least of the aggregation that's happening within government structures by many people in Silicon Valley, is this really a wise choice? And is the appropriate locus of control within the government, or is it some sort of other arrangement that doesn't necessarily aggregate and share information in the ways that have initially been proposed, at least in Congress? The definitions of critical infrastructure, the definitions of what should be shared, all of this is in flux. These bills have not succeeded to this point. And in particular, some of the drafts demonstrate what could be said to be a confounding of intellectual property interests framed in the most aggressive posture in ways that might not be ideally harmonized with good information security goals. And so this, again, tension between innovation policy and security presents a set of concerns for us to ponder going forward. The conversations that I've had with members of Congress have, off the record, conveyed to me both a hopeful dynamic and a slightly troubling dynamic. On the hopeful side, members of Congress have mentioned to me that people in Congress are willing to work across party lines on questions of preserving digital liberties and on questions of information security policy. However, there's also a second group who appear reticent to engage with the technology reality that information security policy warrants, and are acting in ways that appear to be more in line with being beholden to certain special interests. And so the question of the tainting of this discourse in the United States with certain overly aggressive IP, intellectual property-centric analyses, and having the realities of technology needs, regardless of political affiliation across lines, these necessities are on the radar of many members of Congress, but cooperation is challenging in some instances. And so perhaps the most important point that I'd like to share and hope that will evolve is echoing the themes of the prior panel. Creating a common language becomes of paramount importance in this space. We see some members of Congress and members of the technology community being particularly engaged with this idea of fixing the low-hanging fruit of information security. And that's a win, both in terms of preserving civil liberties and economic rights of individuals to create, to innovate, and to build themselves as economically self-realizing individuals, as well as thinking humans engaged in discourse, political and otherwise. But simultaneously, fixing these low-hanging fruit types of problems benefits national security as a whole. There are win-wins that can be found in the current state of information security, but gaining this common language and cooperation is absolutely critical. The common language is lacking across business and government. You'll notice even that the language that I'm using in describing some of these problems doesn't necessarily map onto some of the policy conversations that we see in these spaces. Internationally, there's a disjuncture, particularly in the intersection of information security questions and broader innovation policy and intellectual property debates. So the role of, in the United States, trade secret law, the role of code patenting, these things are question marks. The extent to which databases are copyrightable. All of this is implicated in this conversation as a set of underlying assumptions that are unresolved. The communication cultures that we heard about in the prior panel cross over into all of these spaces as well. And in particular, the deficits in metrics that allow for communication across disciplines, across fields of government, business, and other types of informal communities. One of the challenges in information security is, of course, that there is a budding informal hacker culture that doesn't necessarily play into our traditional structures of control. Having those discourses blended into our broader policy conversations, it's absolutely critical, because a few individuals with a goal can disrupt policy in unforeseen ways purely because of their technology prowess. Recognizing these challenges and coming up with understandable metrics that transcend each of these spaces is of paramount importance. We don't even have common language about vulnerabilities. Assessing the severity, the actionability, and the importance of different types of security vulnerabilities, both from the standpoint of government security and citizen integrity and innovation policy and protecting intellectual property interests of companies. Until we can generate this kind of common language, we will have difficulty collaborating across international spaces and across government and business spaces. So that is my call to action and my request for metrics in particular as a starting point for the important work that this center will continue to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That's very, very useful. Our second speaker, Gilberto, is a Brazilian attorney, academic, and consultant. Teaches internet law, has helped the Brazilian government in drafting legislation on cybercrime, working with the Eastern Caribbean countries with the ITU, and also a member of expert committees at the United Nations. Gilberto, very interested to hear about the debate in Brazil on cybersecurity and human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I wanted to congratulate Oxford Martin for the initiative of setting up this Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center. And also to thank Sadie for the invitation. I also wanted to congratulate the whole team for this immaculate organization of this conference. My presentation deals with how Brazil has handled the debate on cybersecurity vis-a-vis human rights. This is certainly a quite challenging and timely subject, given the widespread publicity on the Snowden affair, as well as some interesting events that are taking place in Brazil right now. Brazil has played an important role as it stands for an expressive number of internet users, being the 5th largest worldwide, and it has been ranked among the countries most affected by cybercrime, being number 3 in child pornography, and seeing a fraud in every 15 seconds. And it has a very peculiar history of regulation in the IT field. In the 70s and 80s, it was a world benchmark in the volume of regulations for IT. It was a time of a market reservation policy. Then for 2 decades, there was very little legislative or regulatory activity. And finally, since the turn of the millennium, we have seen a wave of statutes launched in a concerted fashion and launched taking benefit of this long period of observation of lessons learned abroad. Such background has led to the so-called civil landmark for the internet, which is a piece of legislation aimed to head integrated architecture, holistic architecture. This has result of a process, online process open to the public, in which first phase the public was invited to offer feedback on certain issues put by the local steering committee for the internet. And in the second phase, the public was invited to validate the wording proposed to reflect the outcome of the first phase. This process has ensured a great level, a very interesting level of legitimacy. More than 2,000 formal propositions were received from the public, and thousands of other suggestions were collected via specific blogs and other channels. The idea behind the civil landmark is to build a coherent and cohesive architecture by asserting very comprehensive grounds such as human rights, plurality, diversity, openness, cooperation, social aim, free initiative, free competition, consumer protection, global network, and also a very comprehensive set of principles with freedom of information, privacy and data protection, network neutrality, security, compatible with international standards and best practices, as written down, participative nature, and ISP's liability. And finally, by means of consistent terminology, by means of a combination of legal rules and standards especially procedural standards like ISO 27000, focusing on enforcement both in terms of repression and of prevention, and integrating criminal with civil and administrative rules. I would call attention to this aspect. I have mapped out for the United Nations the legislations of 91 countries regarding identity-related matters, and I could see that many countries have only criminal legislation on identity theft, and this may be a cause of deficiencies in this kind of legislations, the lack of supporting civil legislation, corresponding civil legislation. Well, the civil landmark it purports to be an umbrella for statutes such as the freedom of information, cybercrime, and child pornography, and also for regulations and bills of law on e-consumer, mobile payments, cybersecurity, IP reform, e-transactions standards, data protection, surveillance reform, and cloud computing. This organicity is also ensured by a common set of terminology. So the same concepts, the same definitions appear in several statutes that incorporate them. So the judges and experts and society in general can clearly visualize what they should understand with those concepts. For instance, personal information, which is referred to in civil landmark and is defined in the corresponding Bill of Law. Being such a comprehensive and integrated architecture, it attracts a number of debates and a great deal of contention, as it purports to bridge possibly opposite ends such as privacy and security. The main debates that have remained in the course of this process of legislative approval have been with regards to privacy, the no notice and takedown. There's a general rule that ISPs are not required to accept notice and takedown procedures except for IP content. So the discussion here is whether or not IP content is too overly broad an exception. Also, regarding merging industries and technologies, for instance, mobile payments, should a service provider in mobile payments possess banking secrecies and telecommunication secrecies, not being either a bank or a telco? Secondly, the principle of neutrality, imposing that there shall be no discrimination of users or of usage for the sake of safeguarding privacy. So ISPs shall not discriminate based on contents or on origin of messages or of posts. And the only acceptable discrimination is where there is some inevitable technical requirement. And in this case, there should be a wide disclosure. Regarding security, there is some intent on regulating about surveillance, and especially with regards to information about Brazilians. There was a precedent which has been recalled of a large ISP that had refused to cooperate with the government in the fight against child pornography, and the reason alleged was that the server was located in another country and it belonged to the parent company, not to the Brazilian subsidiary. And so Brazil has considered to establish some kind of protection of easier access to information about Brazilians, not necessarily to require local presence of data servers, as it has been a practice in many countries. Perhaps there should be an intermediate solution, for instance, not requiring the local presence of the equipment, but requiring a commitment of availability of access to a link, which might be much more consistent with cloud computing and the natural evolution of technology. Also, given the interoperability of the combat against cybercrime, perhaps there should be a global landmark, not only a country landmark. And so Brazil, together with Germany, has submitted to the United Nations a draft resolution calling attention to Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that the countries must count on legislation for protecting private life. In a world of digital environment, if we don't have legislation, specific legislation for online privacy, this article of the declaration is almost empty. Well, okay. In countries of codified law, it's very important that fundamental principles such as security and privacy, they follow parallel but intertwined paths downwards from the federal constitution to statutory law and to regulation. This is fostered by that cohesive architecture. For instance, the case of mobile payments, we can see that it mingles as it goes down into deeper regulation. Also, Brazil has adopted a pyramidal cascade of regulations on information security, covering a wide range of topics such as inventory, audit, training and certification, very close to capacity center, cryptography, use of cloud computing, social networks, mobile device, and it may develop a new platform for e-government with open software, a non-email system, despite natural challenges of reducing dependency of traditional suppliers and managing inherited legacies and so on. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of those regulations is the initiative of embedding privacy concerns in it altogether. For instance, those regulations clarifying what should be understood as confidential and standards and guidelines for development and acquisition of software as a way to protect data storage and processing. As a conclusion, may I say that the Brazilian experience on building such kind of architecture, as well as the cooperative process that has preceded and the discussions that have remained, may be an opportunity for academic exchange in the form of shared lines of research. In case we can find some areas of mutual cooperation, I would be more than happy to join such effort as a possible way to minimally reciprocate your generosity in inviting me to attend such important conference. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Gilberto, and I think that's very much the kind of research that we're hoping to take forward in the centre. Finally, for our panel, Douwe Korf, a Professor of International Law at London Metropolitan University, has been working in this field for many decades, was head of European research for Amnesty International in the 1970s and 80s, then taught at the universities of Maastricht and Essex before moving to London Met. He has taken several leading cases to the European Court of Human Rights, including McCann versus the United Kingdom, and wrote the Council of Europe Human Rights Handbook on Article 2 ECHR. And it's been my pleasure to work with Douwe over the last few years in some of the online human rights issues that he's going to outline now.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much, Ian. And this is a great school and a great centre, and I'm very pleased to be associated with it, Sadie. Yes, I go back a long way, Ian. I used to deal with terrorism, or rather anti-terrorist legislation in Europe in the 1970s and 80s, in the UK, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Italy, Spain, and especially also Germany. And strangely enough, I then since moved in a totally different way to data protection, and over the last 5, 6, 8, 10 years, these two completely different strands have merged, so that my privacy-related work and my, if you like, sort of old-fashioned human rights work have very closely come together in a very interesting way. when I worked on anti-terrorist legislation in the 1970s and 80s, the main issues were changes in the laws. The one typical phenomenon of anti-terrorist legislation is special laws, special processes, special fora like the Diplo courts in Northern Ireland. But by and large, the debate was still in the context of what I should call the law enforcement paradigm. The aim was to try and keep the Diplo courts as close as possible as the fair trial requirements for ordinary citizens and ordinary people, and to keep powers of the police and the army as close as possible to ordinary police powers. And one thing that we have seen, especially since 9/11, and in particular with regard to the actions of the United States, is a shift to a national security paradigm, to almost a armed conflict paradigm in the measures taken against what are seen as serious threats to civilized society the world over, ranging from child pornography to organized crime to terrorism and extremism. I'll come back to those concepts a bit later. It was said by someone in the previous panel that there is this risk of an end to privacy, an end to unidentifiability on the internet or in the digital era, which is something Ian and I have been writing about, and it is definitely one of the most serious problems in an era of smart data and big data and ever greater release of data through social networks and the Internet of Things and all those things. But let me warn you, you cannot have a society, a decent society, with no privacy. Privacy underpins all kind of other democratic values. You cannot have, in the modern era, freedom of association, freedom of communication, freedom of political activism without privacy. And so when we talk about privacy, I actually always hesitate about it because it is wider than that. The German Constitutional Court recognized this as far back as 1982 in its very famous census judgment. And I paraphrase, it said, a society in which the citizen must fear that whatever he does is being watched by the state, that it is recorded to whatever meetings he goes, who he associates with, what opinions he expresses, where and to whom, is no longer a free and democratic society. So if you say we're moving to a situation in which there's no longer any privacy, you're effectively saying we're moving to a situation in which there is no longer a free and democratic society, and I don't think we want that to happen. So let me be more specific. It's already been mentioned by several others, but there are certain aspects of the digital environment in which we operate these days that are special compared to things that happened in the 20th century. The internet and mobile communications are by their nature global. And that is really important. The data goes everywhere. Where your server is really not the most important thing, as my predecessor also says. Your data can be anywhere and nowhere at the same time. And an awful lot of it is in the United States, of course, I might add. And the other thing is that very much of the internet is controlled by private entities. And I really did like the comparison with the tractors. Even if the state would like to regulate all kind of aspects of the internet, the people who maintain the tractors, who build them and maintain them, and who provide the fuel are private companies. Again, largely, to a large extent, still United States companies, but it's a global industry and it's a global commercial context within that operates. And that brings me to the absence of a proper legal framework for the internet. And being a lawyer, I like to see a proper legal framework everywhere, because you cannot have rights if you haven't got law, and if you haven't got processes by which you can defend your rights, and if the powers that be aren't subject to law. And that happens in particular in a number of contexts that are most worrying. The cross-border context and national security context, and the fulcrum being cross-border national security activities. But in fact, all cross-border activities have this problem of being, how do you regulate what happens on the internet? And all national security issues have this problem. But if you combine them, you really go into serious problems. That ties in with a question of definitions as well. I started talking about terrorism. It is difficult enough nowadays. It was difficult enough in the 1970s to define what constitutes terrorism, and especially what constitutes a terrorist-related crime. And there's a tendency in anti-terrorist legislation, national security legislation, for these things to widen and widen. Everybody knows that blowing up a bomb is a terrorist act. But when you start going to support for terrorist organizations, when you stretch that to not just financial support or physical support, but to moral support for terrorist organizations, when you stretch anti-terrorist legislation not just to extremists, which is difficult enough, but to grooming people to becoming extremists, you get into very dangerous waters. When you try and apply legislation in this context extraterritorially, you really get into trouble. There are groups that we in Europe regard as freedom fighters and the United States regards as terrorists, and I'm sure it's the other way around as well. Support for one of these organizations in one country may well be legal in that country, but illegal in another one. If you make expressions on the internet, you may be transgressing the country. You may be in accordance with the country where you're actually based, where you're making your expression, if you like, but you may be contravening laws in the countries where somebody reads your expression. Just 1 minute, my God! I always have going on to that. Right. So this is an extremely difficult issue. It's not only you have similar problems with the concept of cybercrime, and I think even with cybersecurity, which is the core issue here today. The biggest threat, the one that I want to mention if I only got 30 seconds left, is an absence of law. The United States, or rather the United States red lines on the negotiations for the UN General Assembly resolution on privacy in the digital era were just leaked a few days ago. The first point that the United States puts down as its biggest red line: we do not want to extend our international human rights obligations to extraterritorial activities of the United States. That is the deepest threat to the international rule of law and international human rights that I can think of. If the United States says, whatever we do outside the United States with regard to people who are not citizens or residents of the United States is not protected by human rights, that is an atrocious statement for a state that wants to be deemed to be the leader of the Western world. Since the Second World War, the concept has been everyone has the same rights. And since the invention of the internet, it is everyone has the same rights wherever he is in the world, offline or online. It's going to be very difficult to come up with the answer. Maybe we can discuss it a bit here, but I hope that we at least don't forget that that is the promise that was made to the world in 1948 and beyond. Thanks.
Thanks, Douwe. So 3 very thought-provoking presentations. I'd like to ask for questions just in 1 second, but I also wanted to say people are watching us online on the webcast. So to those people, if you would like to tweet questions, the hashtag is CyberOx. I will try to throw in a couple of tweeted remote questions also. So who in the audience would like to begin?
Right, so I really like the
microphone.
Oh, sorry. I really like the rights discourse, and I'm very sympathetic to all of it. And I keep thinking that Ian mentioned at the beginning the European Convention on Human Rights, and if memory serves, and it'll be dim memory, there is a clause about human rights that derogates in case of a national emergency. So the principles that hold under almost every circumstance unless there's a national crisis. So what worries me, what concerns me, is that we don't seem to have any sort of shared agreement on who gets to make the determination of when we're in a national crisis. I say this as an American who was deeply troubled by the events that followed 9/11, which our president and his administration poofed up into a threat to our national survival. And then once that happened, it created a permanent emergency state that essentially means that we can invariably derogate from our obligations both nationally and internationally. And this is actually the trail of breadcrumbs that leads to Snowden's revelation. In other words, if you have as basis of your idea that human rights are about protecting individuals, if there's a floor beyond which no state may go, except in this one circumstance, and you don't have any guidelines about when that circumstance can be just sort of charismatically transgressed. The president got up and said, we are at war, and once we're at war, then anything goes. Is what you guys do, like, Is it worthwhile?
I know that Dow
I mean,
called for-
is there any point to it? You know,
I'm
so-
not going to talk for hours on it. The main thing is Article 15 of the European Convention of Human Rights. It's also in Article 4 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. The most important issue is the derogation is not a blank check. You can derogate only to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. So and it must still be based on law, it must be necessary and proportionate, even if you talk about a derogation. The problem with anti-terrorist situations and what's happening now with the NSA is that what the derogations were drafted for short-term extreme emergencies, literally war, a civil war, or perhaps a massive catastrophe like you have in the Philippines, where you may have to tell people, no, you can't stay in your house, you have to move out of this area, there's a danger. Or Japan and the nuclear problem there. The problem with terrorism is that it tends to become what I've called since 1982, would you believe it? It tends to embed quasi-permanent semi-emergencies. So what was conceived for the extremely exceptional circumstance becomes the normal. And the only way to deal with that is to try and move this, what is strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, as high as possible, as close as possible to the ordinary level of human rights protection.
Okay, David, could you pass the mic over? Thanks.
So sort of as a follow-on to that, can you have rights without enforcement? And who would be the equivalent of the blue helmets for the cyber world?
Let me just say, I'll ask our speakers just one person to answer each question, so we don't get into a long series of answers to each question. Who would like to address that, Gilberto or Dara?
You don't?
Let Gilberto, yeah.
Well, I believe enforcement, to be effective, really effective, must count on laws. And about this discussion on the limits between terrorism and non-terrorist acts, in Brazil there is an intention to regulate this subsequently, and with the idea that you would probably not share information, but you should share criterion. Criterion should be transparent. So the civil landmark says that the government must publish what are the criteria that will guide monitoring. And this should be written down in a law so that it could be enforced.
Okay, Dawa for 10 seconds, then we have a burning question
Your-
at the back.
Your blue helmet.
David, sorry, we've got to keep to time. Dawa.
Your blue helmet. I'm saying Vivian Redding, Giovanni Buttarelli, and the European Data Protection Authorities. Well, they're supposed to.
Thank you. My name's Dana. I'm with the CDT as a DPhil student. My question is in reference to Gilberto's statement that Brazil and Germany have submitted a draft resolution to the United Nations. What I would like to know is who do you anticipate will be pushing back on this resolution? For what reasons? And how do you anticipate that Brazil and Germany will respond to the inevitable pushback that will probably accompany the submission of this resolution?
I may not have the most complete answer to this, as it involves some political contents, but it looks like the G20 would be supportive to this resolution. And Singapore and other countries have already anticipated, voiced their support. There has been some news on the press that Germany may get some access to the Five Eyes, informal access. So I don't know what would be the next political developments in this, but that might be a situation where the G20 would try to convey their points to the G8, probably.
Thank you. By the way, I'm tweeting where I know there are news stories that address some of the questions or reports. I'm tweeting them on the same hashtag if you want to look to them. Is Maria Farrell in the audience? I wanted Maria, if just for 30 seconds, if you could, Maria. I know you were working at ICANN during a period in which there was great discussion in ICANN about privacy and the WHOIS directory of domain names. I wondered if you wanted to make just a couple of points about that.
Hi, thank you. I'm Maria Farrell. Just arrived back this morning from ICANN in Buenos Aires, and I know Martin Boyle and Zahid Jamil also have done so. 30 seconds on Whois is difficult. Whois is a publicly available database of every person who registers a domain name in a generic top-level domain like .com or going forwards .london.wales. It's required to be published, and even though that is in direct contravention with all European data protection laws. Why? Well, there were some interesting points earlier. You can't have rights if you don't have law. Sometimes even if you do have law, you don't have rights. Why is it that European data protection law, the promulgated law of 27 member states of the biggest trading bloc in the world, somehow can't find its way to implementation by a California non-profit with less than 200 employees? I guess the answer is not the battle of ideas, as Dawei might have said, but actually a simple question of power, of raw economic and political power. Because always what we find, as the first speaker talked about, in the need to reconcile or coordinate private and public sectors, typically we find in the privacy world an unholy alliance of trademark or intellectual property interests and law enforcement interests. And the bodies within ICANN that should be pursuing also citizens' interests, protecting and upholding their own laws, we find that they're not doing that. I'll just probably wrap up by saying one of the most startling things I've ever seen at an international meeting was a year ago in ICANN in Toronto. We've got a different place to go every 3 or 4 months. When the European Commission representative said that European data protection law was Europe's law, but it was not a negotiating position. So I think I hope that this centre will start to look at the raw realities of power and how it manifests broadly, freedom versus privacy, because we all know privacy is an individual right, but something that upholds larger political and public goods such as freedom of expression and democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. That's great. David, I see your tweet, and let me come back to your question, because it links to another question from Alexander Korf, who I think Dower knows. Alexander says, his question is, to what extent is it legal for the US to purport to deny privacy rights, etc., to non-US nationals? To put it in David's terms, who will stop them? Is that fair, David? Who will enforce? Is it purely might is right, or who enforces the rights? Sure. Who will march in Dower? Who has the blue helmet on the internet?
Well, the first point, under international law, of course, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights was drafted before the internet came into account. So it talks about states acting within their jurisdiction. And that requires some interpretation when it comes to the internet. The guidance, both from Europe and from the Human Rights Committee, which interprets the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, is that when states exercise their power somewhere, then they have to respect their international human rights commitments. And I think that's the universal attitude taken by all the international human rights community. So if the United States does something outside its own territory that affects people, then it still has to respect its commitments under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. A report on the US, who's enforcing it? Ultimately, the international community itself. And that is the way international law works. If there is a condemnation from the Human Rights Council of what's happening, what's being done by the United States at the moment, that is a very important and strong signal to the international community. I would be surprised if there wasn't some response from even the biggest player on the football field, the United States, to a condemnation of that sort. On top of that, there are repercussions in trade and especially in data sharing. The Europeans will not be able to come up with good data sharing arrangements, either in national security or in trade or in other areas like travel, if the United States isn't willing to concede that it will have to respect the rights of Europeans.
But so, at a certain point, lawfare goes to warfare before we actually have to send the troops. So who is the enforcer?
Okay, let me bring in someone else I know who has something to say on these questions. And you're right, David. And at some point, it comes back to the might is right and what will be the negative consequences of not following this. Is Yudhishthira Nugraha in the audience right now? Yudi, great. Yudi is studying with us in our new doctoral training centre in cybersecurity, but he was previously an official in the Indonesian government that was working on cybersecurity policy. Of course, there's been a lot in the news, Yudi, in the last week about allegations of attacks on very senior Indonesian officials' communications. I wonder if you could just for 30 seconds perhaps say a little bit about that public debate in Indonesia and what the Indonesian government is doing in response to what has been revealed in the last week.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Dr. Yan. First of all, I'm Yudi, CDT student in cybersecurity. Before, I think we had a meeting with the Minister Fezi in IG at Bali, so we are looking forward to cooperating with the UK government. I mean, like, in terms, we start talking with cybersecurity when we have meeting the IT Council 2012, 2011, 2013, and then also the London Conference on Cyberspace. I mean, like, first of all, I mean, for the first time, actually, we focus on how to protect our society online. I mean, like, by proposing kind of the idea of developing global cyber security legal framework. I mean, this is important because it could be a problem against human rights if every country, they develop their own standard to protect their online society. So, for instance, in my country, for instance, like filtering content is one of our focus. This could be challenging for human rights, but we also need to respect our legal system. I mean, like, same with Brazilian, we cooperate with ISP to refer to our database. We have sort of database like Trustpositive, Nawala, and etc. And in terms of recently issue, it's a good start to talk with our president. Before, I mean, 2012, we start to talking to our president how important cybersecurity, but he just denied it and then just forward the message to the sectoral ministry, which is our minister. So, is it not important for time being? But I think for now, it's a good time to talk to our president how important cybersecurity, because phone tapping, I mean, like, it's not is new issue, it's like old issue. I mean, like, it's easy, I mean, how to protect our critical information protection. I mean, like, well, I mean, like, we can...
Yudi, sorry, 30 seconds.
Yeah, just one question, like,
yeah.
We cannot work alone, but we have to collaborate with other countries like UK. Thank you.
Okay, and just because Yudi was being too polite, let me concretely say what has happened. As many of you probably know, the Indonesian government is threatening to halt cooperation on people smuggling, and all sorts of other relations between Indonesia and Australia have been very damaged by these revelations. We've got time for one or two more questions. Yeah. Sorry, could you wait for the microphone, please?
Yeah, Jonathan Shorex, head of cybersecurity in the MOD. I'm fascinated that in all the debate this morning about the moral dilemmas, very, very few of the practical dilemmas we're posing are any different to the ones I used to consider when I read PPE in this university 35 years ago, which tells me that the start point for our debate here is not cyber, it's actually security and all the normal developments of society, which means that we can short-circuit an awful lot of our work by starting with the thousands of years of debate about the personal versus state security, privacy issues, all this sort of stuff, and then say, how does this apply to cyberspace? And I think the same goes with matters of law. So instead of saying what new laws do we need for cyberspace, it's actually how do you apply existing law to cyberspace, and equally the question of metrics. I think we can short-circuit the learning process by starting with existing thought and then saying, how does that actually apply in cyberspace? Because so often the thinking has been done, the problem is how do you implement old thinking to the new space of cyberspace?
Yeah, I think that's very right. Do we have any more comments or questions? We've got just a couple of minutes left. Pause, hold just for 1 second, Andrea. Does anyone else have anything to put in before we'll come back and have a final set of answers and wrap up? No? Okay, great. In that case, Andrea, then Dawa, then Gilberto, perhaps just a couple of final thoughts.
So just commenting on the last question and comment, I think that's a critical perspective. There are bodies of law and policy and learning that we can turn to in these cases, and they offer us useful historical guidance. The first step is figuring out what we can apply and where the knowledge that exists ends and where we really do need new approaches. Starting with the idea of novelty and working backwards is not as desirable as starting with the idea of what is similar here and where is it that we need to add something that is unique. And so having that historical and social context is absolutely critical in this debate.
Thanks, Andrea.
And very briefly, important to mention the Cybercrime Convention, which is a global convention that governs the fight against cybercrime. I hope that the systems there can be made and continue to be human rights compatible. And there's an optional protocol under discussion which does the opposite, which I'm very worried about. So I think there are ways of moving forward, but they're not easy. And we'll have to fight about it.
Thank you. Gilberto?
I guess, of course, you can build upon existing laws. And this is a way of approximation to digital world, as in the case of the German Constitutional Court decision about how to implement the privacy directive, European privacy directive vis-à-vis terrorism. But it would be much more effective if you have an integrated architecture, civil and criminal. And I guess this initiative here, this Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center, might be an excellent opportunity and forum for this kind of endeavor.
Thanks, Gilberto. That's a perfect wrap-up to this session. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to all of you for your questions. And if we could thank the speakers and then go for lunch.